Thank you, good evening. So I want to talk about what is being called the third revolution in warfare. The first revolution was when the Chinese invented gunpowder, and that changed warfare from being a very personal, hands-on, bloody thing to something where we use guns and bombs to fight more at a distance. Second revolution was when we invented nuclear bombs, and that changed, again, the complete nature of warfare. We had a technology there where we could potentially wipe out all of humanity. And people, rather dramatically, have talked about autonomous weapons as being potentially the third revolution in warfare that will change completely the nature of warfare. But the story begins when I was a young boy. This is me. And I was dreaming about a future. The future was one that was full of robots and artificial intelligence, rather cuddly-looking robots. And it was a very optimistic future, as only a young boy like myself could have at the time. And it's been a really interesting journey the last 25 years, working on that dream I had, that daydreams I had as a young boy, thinking about artificial intelligence. Now, a lot of that progress has come from Moore's law. Every 18 months or so, we've seen a doubling in the computing power that we have, and that's brought us a huge amount of advancement. But we've also seen a huge amount of advancement in the algorithms, the computer code that we write that goes into building the smarts to our computers. And we're seeing a payback for that today. We're seeing remarkable changes, things that even I am, as an expert in the field, I'm constantly being surprised by. Earlier this week, we saw AlphaGo beat one of the world's leading players at Go, the ancient Chinese game, thousands of years old, this game, with immense complexity. This is the Mount Everest of board games. It is probably the most challenging of board games that we play professionally. And Go masters had said, you'll never beat us at Go. It's a really intuitive, human, challenging game. Even those of us who worked in the field who were confident we'd eventually get there, the computers would eventually be smart enough that we would be able to beat the Go masters, thought it was at least perhaps 10 years, a decade away before we would beat the human grandmasters at Go. And so it was, an immense landmark moment earlier this week when mankind was again knocked off his pedestal. We were beaten 4-1. All credit to Lisa Doyle. He put up a fighting finish to win one game and to put a very exciting game on in the final match. But now humans are no longer necessarily the best at this challenging board game. And there's many other examples we see almost daily of the progress that we're making in artificial intelligence. As we heard and saw in the videos in the introduction, here at UNSW, we're helping to lead this advance. We are the reigning world champions at robot soccer. In fact, we're 5 times world champions. And so we are one of the leading centers helping to build this technology that is going to hopefully make our lives healthier, wealthier, and happier. But whilst I've been having this dream of building a better, brighter future, unfortunately, the world's starting to look, or at least the future's starting to look less optimistic. We have the ongoing global financial crisis. And it seems we'll never actually get out of the ongoing global financial crisis. We have global warming. And again, we're starting to witness some of the hottest months ever on record. And the consequences that's going to have on our agriculture, on our lives, on our cities. We have the threat of global pandemics. And we have, all our problems seem to be global these days. We have a new global problem, this global refugee problem that is starting to worry many of us. And so the world seems to be, or at least the future seems to be, less optimistic than when I was a young boy dreaming about the prospect of artificial intelligence and robotics and the life that will give us, the interesting life and improvements that will give us. And part of that worry, part of that concern, is a concern that people have about where artificial intelligence and where robotics might take us. So this is the point in the lecture where I put up a picture of Terminator. Because whenever I talk to the media, and I get requests to talk to the media almost daily to talk about these sorts of issues, they put up a picture of Terminator. So I'm going to put up a picture of Terminator and tell you, this is not a lecture about Terminator. I'm not going to talk much at all about Terminator. Terminator is something that is probably 50, maybe even 100 years away. And I'm going to talk about how we can avoid actually going down the road whose endpoint will be exactly that endpoint, that dystopian endpoint that Hollywood has painted in movies like Terminator. I'm going to talk about technologies that actually are much nearer, much more stupid than you would imagine Terminator. Now, most of you will have seen drones flying above the skies of Afghanistan and Iraq. This is a Predator drone that is flying above Afghanistan and Iraq. This is not an autonomous weapon. There's still a human. There's a soldier back in a container in Nevada who is flying this thing and is making that decision to fire its rather aptly named Hellfire missile, making that final life or death decision as to whether to take someone out on the ground. But it's a very small engineering leap to go from that remotely controlled drone, to something that would be completely autonomous. To take the human out of the loop, to have a computer fly that plane and make that final life or death decision as to whether to fire its missile. Now that's not something that actually is technically very near. If you believe the UK's Ministry of Defence, they believe it's technically possible today. And I, certainly as an expert in the area, know that is at worst or best a few years away. That's the sort of technology that I want to focus on tonight. That's the sort of technology that I think we should be worried about. And that's the sort of technology that not myself, but thousands of my colleagues have come together. I helped put together an open letter that was signed by myself and many of my colleagues last year, in July last year, that was released at the start of the main artificial intelligence conference that was held in Buenos Aires in Argentina, calling upon the United Nations to put a ban together on what we call is offensive autonomous weapons. Now, I got 1,000 of my colleagues, rounded them up, and they signed this letter, which we released to the press. At the end of the first day, we had 2,000 signatures. Today, more than 20,000 people have signed that letter. The signatures include many well-known names: the physicist Stephen Hawking, the technologist Elon Musk, the political scientist and activist Noam Chomsky. Many well-known names. But what was more significant, I think, and more newsworthy about that moment was that it was signed by many of the leading researchers, not just by myself, but by thousands of my colleagues. Leading researchers at Facebook, at Google, Dennis Hassabis, the guy behind DeepMind, the AlphaGo program that I mentioned just now. The president of the main Association for the Advancement of Artificial Intelligence, many past presidents, many leading researchers in robotics and artificial intelligence from around the world. Many of the countries from around the world came together and signed that letter. The AI community is not that big. There's only a couple of thousand people working in AI and robotics in academia around the world. Many of those people have signed that letter. So I think you should stop for a moment and think about that. Many of the leading researchers who should understand this technology best, who should understand the trajectory of this technology best, came together and signed a letter with a very clear message, which is that we have a small window of opportunity to get a ban in place on these sorts of technologies, and that we should seize this moment. Now, I'd have thought putting a ban on killer robots was a pretty much no-brainer idea. Who would like killer robots? Certainly all the movies that you see from Hollywood with killer robots look like a very bad place for us to end up. But it's not a completely black and white issue, and so I want to spend a few moments in this lecture going through some of the arguments on both sides as to why we should not have a ban for killer robots. Let me start with the arguments for, the arguments that myself and thousands of my colleagues were convinced by in signing that letter. So I'm going to give you just 5 arguments. These aren't the only 5 arguments, and I hope we're going to have an exciting question and answer session at the end, and I'm happy to discuss some of the other arguments, but I'm just going to put 5 of the stronger arguments, 5 of the more common arguments that get put up for the reason we should start thinking about a ban today. The first argument is that this actually is something that's very near. This is a prototype of the very latest drone. It was built by British Aerospace. This drone will fly completely automatically. It's a completely autonomous drone. This is why the UK's Ministry of Defence have said they think it's technically possible. They have a prototype. It's flying. It can fly without the aid of any human. And it's a really challenging moral threshold for us to cross. If we give computers the right to make life or death decisions and have humans no longer in the loop. The second argument is that we have to think about where will this take us. There will be an arms race. These are pictures of robots produced by a Google company, an Alphabet company, Boston Dynamics. I said at the start of the lecture that Terminator was perhaps 50 or 100 years away. But if you've seen some of the rather terrifying videos that Boston Dynamics have released with their humanoid robots, the second robot here, the Atlas robot, that can walk through rough terrain, that can pick itself up when it's knocked over. Actually, I started to think maybe I'm going to have to stop saying it's 50 to 100 years away. I'm going to have to start saying it's 30 to 50 years away. Because you see the advancement in the technology. You see that there will be an arms race. You see that people, researchers in the Soviet Union, the researchers in Russia, in China, will also be working on this technology. There will be an arms race. And you have to think, well, where is this arms race going to end? And it's going to end exactly where Hollywood tells you it's going to end. Hollywood gets lots of things wrong, but actually there's a lot. If you pick the right things out in Hollywood, there's a lot that's right in Hollywood. And the end point is one that Hollywood has told us what it will be. If we let this go unchecked, it will be that terrifying, frightening picture that you see in movies like Terminator. There will be an arms race, and it's clear what the end point will be. The third argument is that this is actually a very worrying technology. We've seen other dangerous technologies, weapons of mass destruction. Nuclear weapons, very dangerous technology that we have, of course, regulated. But there, at least, it's a challenge for the weapon to proliferate. You have to have the resources of a pretty decent nation state to build yourself a nuclear weapon. You have to get yourself access to some uranium or some plutonium to be able to build a nuclear device. But with killer robots, we're talking about a technology which will be much, much cheaper, will be much easier to develop, will much be easier to copy once we've actually militarized the technology. So it's clear that this is a technology where it's going to be much more challenging, much more difficult to regulate. And that's I'll come to that argument in a second. A fourth argument is that there will be lots of civilian casualties. A few months back, at the end of last year, there were some secret papers that were leaked out of the Pentagon that have been called the drone papers, looking at the success of the drone program that the United States has been flying for the last couple of years. And frighteningly, the statistic that they came out with there was that 9 out of the people that they had killed, that they had targeted with drones, were not the intended targets. Now that's why you've still got a human in the loop. You've got a human, a very capable human, who's actually making that final life or death decision, who's got immense situational awareness, is able to make that critical life or death decision. And they're making 9 out of 10 mistakes. Now I can tell you, with the current state of art, as a technologist, I would aspire to get to 9 out of 10. It's going to be much worse to begin with. Now, eventually, of course, I'm sure we will get the technology to the point where we're doing better than humans. But certainly the technology that we could field today, the technology that for surely will be fielded quite soon by the military, will not be reaching the capability of humans, and will be making many more mistakes. And many of those mistakes, as is unfortunately the case with warfare today, will be innocent civilians, women and children caught in the crossfire of these battles. And the final argument is that these are going to be very hard to regulate. And therefore we have to start thinking about it now before the technology becomes very mature. It's very hard to take the technology out of the hands of the military. They've already got quite used to flying drones. It would be very hard to tell them, sorry, we're going to take that technology away from you. So we have a limited window of opportunity here to get a ban in place, to be able to regulate the technology before it is out there and Pandora's box has been opened and we can't put the technology back in the box. So as I said, those are some of the stronger arguments for putting a ban in place. I'm happy to discuss later on in the Q&A some of the other arguments. These aren't the only arguments for, but those alone would be enough to convince me that we have a small opportunity, a small window in which we could put a ban in place, and that we should seize that moment. Oh, I said 5 reasons. Actually, I'm going to give you a 6th reason. The 6th reason, and this one is a very personal reason, because I understand and expect this actually to be rather a personal reason. This is more a personal attitude to warfare, which is that warfare for me is something I believe should always be a matter of last resort. War should never be easy. And we shouldn't be seduced by technologies that allow us to think we can fight clean, clinical warfare. First of all, I think we're wrong. The drone papers demonstrate, in fact, we're misguided. It's a misconception to think that we can fight clean, clinical warfare. 9 out of 10 of the people being killed were not the people we were intending to target. But it should be a matter of last resort. Politicians shouldn't be able to think this is something that they can easily do. It should be that there are body bags that will be coming home, that they have to justify to us that it is our sons and daughters that are coming home in those body bags, so that it is always a matter of last resort. Warfare is a bloody, terrible, nasty business, and probably it should remain that way, so we only ever fight it as a matter of last recourse. And perhaps it's a little too easy for people like the President of the United States to sit in the comfort of the White House and to think he can call the drones in and he doesn't have to risk US soldiers. And that it's actually probably drawn us into those conflicts, that seductive idea that we can fight these wars remotely. And in fact, actually, we're discovering, I think, that actually it's not effective. You can't win the war from the air. You won't be able to win the war with drones, whether they're autonomous or not. That you will ultimately have to put boots in the ground, and you will have to deal with the difficult problems of solving those situations in the Middle East and elsewhere, and that we can't just solve the problem with technology. But as I said, I suspect that's probably a more personal reason. Okay, so I hope that started to convince you, if you weren't already convinced, that we should be thinking about a ban for killer robots, that this would be a good idea, and that we have a moment in time, a moment in history, where we can come together and do the right thing here. But I wouldn't want you to come away from this lecture thinking that it's a completely black or white issue. There are certainly arguments to be had on the other side, and I'm pleased that you've come to hear these arguments, to hear both sides of the argument. So let me present some of the other arguments. And to be fair, I'm going to give it the same number of arguments the other side. But again, these aren't the only arguments, and I'm happy to discuss some of the other arguments in the Q&A at the end. So we're going to give 5 of what I've received as probably the 5 more common arguments that I've got back as to why we wouldn't want a ban. Let me start with the first one. Robots will be better at killing. Actually, I thought that's why we wanted a ban. Yes, robots will be better at killing. That's why the military are attracted by this idea. They're going to be able to fight 24/7. They're never going to tire. They're never going to need rest. They're never going to need to be fed. If they get damaged, we can replace them with another cheap robot. Yes, they're going to be frighteningly, terrifyingly efficient. And once the technology gets better and better, as it eventually will, they'll be more effective as well. Not just killing the wrong people, they'll be killing the right people. But just because we have a technology that's more efficient doesn't mean that necessarily we need to put it in the battlefield. The history of warfare is largely one of the efficiency with which we can kill the other side. And as we've discovered with nuclear weapons, sometimes it's not necessarily a good idea that we develop a technology, we militarize a technology, and we field it in the battlefield. Sometimes we actually have the right idea that actually it's better, the world will be a better place if we don't go down that road. Number 2, and this argument, number 2, is I think one of the strongest and one of the most interesting arguments that's put up, and one that I'll spend perhaps more time talking about, which is that robots can be more ethical at killing. Warfare is a terrible thing, as I said before. And atrocities get committed in the nature, by the very nature of warfare. If we can build robots will follow precise rules. We can make sure that they follow the precise rules of war. There are precise rules of war. There are rules like proportionality. You can only respond with an action which is proportional to the threat or the attack that you received. You can only attack people fighting the war. You can't target civilians. So we can program, and computers are very precise, we can program them up to follow a very precise ethics. They're not going to commit atrocities like sadly get committed in almost every war that ever gets fought. This is an attractive idea, but it's false. It's false because we don't know how to build ethical robots. We're just working out, we're just starting to think about how we can build ethical robots. It's a really challenging problem. We will, I'm pretty confident, work out how to do that. But it's many years away before we know how to build ethical robots. And we'll have to work out how to do that. We're already starting to field autonomous vehicles. That's going to be a great thing. 1,000 people will die on the roads of Australia this year in car accidents. 95% or more of those car accidents are driver error. Once we have autonomous vehicles, that's going to go away. So we're going to build autonomous cars, but we're still working out how to build ethical cars because they're going to have to make life or death decisions. An accident's going to happen. They're going to have to choose what to do. They're going to have to choose perhaps who's going to die. Is it going to be the driver of the car? Is it going to be the pedestrian that's just stood in the road? They're going to have to make challenging ethical decisions. We don't know how to do that. We don't know how to build ethical cars. We don't know how to build ethical autonomous weapons. And one day we're going to work out how to do that. Unfortunately, that's going to be several years in the future, and the military will have already been fielding some of these autonomous weapons before then. But even when we look at the moment in the future, when we know how to build ethical robots, it's still going to be a challenge. Because one thing we know about computers is that every computer we've ever built can be hacked, can be made to behave in ways that we don't want it. And so surely these computers, these ethical autonomous weapons, will be hacked. And there are plenty of people out there, I'm afraid, who will have no qualms, terrorists and other people who have no qualms about hacking these computers and making them behave in unethical ways. So even if we can build ethical computers, ethical autonomous weapons, there's no preventing them being changed to behave in unethical ways. Okay, our third argument is, well, that's going to be great. Warfare's a nasty thing. We can just get robots fighting robots. Again, that's a hopelessly naive idea. There isn't some separate part of the world called the battlefield. You know, a signpost. Battles over here, please. Battles, sadly, are fought in cities and towns today. We're seeing that with refugees fleeing from Syria. There's innocent bystanders caught up in all these battles. And the other side is not going to sign up to, oh, well, I'm just going to have my robot against your robot. You know, well, I'll fight my robot against your robot, and whoever wins will decide you can take over my country. That's not how wars are fought. If that was how wars are fought, we could decide wars with a game of tiddlywinks. Wars are very asymmetric. The other side, ISIS and the other sides that we tend to be fighting in wars these days, they're not going to sign up to any rules where we just say, my robot against your robot. A fourth argument, this is a very common argument put up, well, we already have killer robots, and we need them. So you can see here a picture of a phalanx anti-missile system. This system is actually used by the Australian Navy and by various other navies. This is actually an autonomous weapon. It defends a ship about an incoming supersonic missile. It has a radar-controlled Gatling gun that will put up a shield of lead that will protect that ship against any incoming supersonic missile. Yes, this is an autonomous weapon, and it's being used today. That's a good thing. I've got nothing against such weapons. It's not an offensive weapon. It's a purely defensive weapon system. It has a very limited envelope of operations. It defends the airspace above and around a ship. It has a very limited operation. It will defend itself just against incoming supersonic missiles. I've got nothing against, and I imagine none of the thousands of other people who signed that open letter have got nothing against such a weapon system that's protecting members of the Australian Navy. That's probably a good thing. But there's no way you could easily turn that into an offensive weapon. That's a defensive weapon system. That's protecting people. It's not taking lives. And the fifth argument is, well, you know, stop being an idealist, Toby. Weapon bans don't work. Well, history will contradict that sort of argument. The 1998 UN Convention on Blinding Lasers exists, and we don't have blinding lasers. When that convention came into place, there were two arms companies in the world, one US, one Chinese, had announced that they were going to build blinding lasers. And we had the technology, and we still have the technology today, to build blinding lasers. But the world made a good decision. The world came together at the United Nations, signed a convention which banned blinding lasers. And if you go to the battlefields of Syria or any of the other battlefields today, you won't find a single blinding laser. You won't find a single arms company anywhere in the world that will sell you a blinding laser. There's a UN ban. And if they started to sell a blinding laser, they'd be put on a blacklist. And they'd lose some business. And there's far more profitable things they can do than getting themselves put on UN blacklists. There's plenty of other ways that the arms companies of the world can make money. So they're not going to bother to go down there. And for that reason, we don't have blinding lasers. If you go to the black markets of arms markets of today, you won't be able to buy yourself a blinding laser. And ISIS and other terrorist organizations are not using blinding lasers. That technology has been effectively banned. We still have that technology. If you go and get your eyes fixed in hospital, it's essentially a blinding laser. We haven't stopped working on on laser technology. We've just not militarized the technology. We've not just built ourselves blinding lasers and put it out there in the battlefield. And there's many good things, like all technologies, that lasers get used for. Every time you go and use the checkout at a supermarket, you're using a laser. And similarly, with autonomous weapons, we're not going to stop the technology being built. As I mentioned, autonomous vehicles have pretty much the same technology. They need to be able to track where they are. They need to be able to navigate through terrain. They need to be able to find a particular destination, a particular target. This is pretty much the same technology. So we're going to develop that technology, and it's going to be a good thing. It's going to save thousands of lives. 1 million people around the world this year will die in road traffic accidents. We're going to look back in 20 years' time from our autonomous cars, and we're going to think, it was the Wild West back then. How did we allow people to sit there and drive their own cars? The world's going to be a much better place because of this sort of technology. It's going to completely change the economics of transportation. A study was done. It showed that the city of Lisbon would require 1/10 of the cars if we had autonomous vehicles. So this is going to be a revolutionary technology. It's going to be a great technology. But like all technologies, we get to use it either for good or bad. The technology is rather morally neutral. We get to choose which path we go down. And what I'm saying tonight, is let's choose the good path. Let's use it just for autonomous vehicles, to make our lives better, to improve our economies, to improve the lives in our cities. Let's not use it for building autonomous weapons. I was pleased to say that a lot of people listened to our lesson. When we published that open letter, it went pretty viral. It appeared in newspapers and in the news around the world, the BBC, New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN. It was covered by a lot of people. And we got the attention of the United Nations. In October, I was invited to the United Nations. Every year, the General Assembly meets. Once the General Assembly has met, it divides into its committees where most of the work goes on. The most important committee is the First Committee. The First Committee discusses disarmament. I was invited to talk at a meeting alongside the First Committee. I was really pleased to be able to talk to the diplomats. I was very impressed by the impression that our open letter had got. I was very surprised to be invited to meet the Under-Secretary General. He's the number 2 in the pecking order in the United Nations. And he said, it's very rare to get a clear message from scientists like this. And when they do, it's something that they will listen to. And many of the other senior diplomats were also listening to this message. I had a one-on-one meeting with the German ambassador, who is chairing the main disarmament talks next month in the United Nations in Geneva. And I've been invited back again to that meeting, along with some other experts, to help push on the discussions, the ongoing discussions that are going on about the possibility of having a ban. And I'm very hopeful that we will help to move forward the discussion. But it doesn't happen in isolation. But I hope I will have convinced many of you in the audience tonight that you don't have to worry too much about this man, the Terminator. That's still 50 or 100 years away, and we have a moment in history where we can stop going down the road with a path that will inevitably lead to this dystopian future, and we can choose to go down a good path where AI and robotics is used to make our lives healthier, wealthier, and happier. But there's a lot still to be done before we have the happier future that I'm talking about. And certainly, I encourage everyone in the audience and everyone who listens to this later on to begin lobbying, to persuade our politicians. Australia has led from the front in many discussions about arms, about weapons of mass destruction. We've taken a very leading role in many of those discussions, in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, in the treaties around biological and chemical weapons. But I'm rather disappointed to say that we have not taken much of a lead in this discussion at all. In fact, we've rather followed on from the US, which has been trying to push to develop the technology. And it's rather embarrassing to see our cousins across the Tasman Sea, the New Zealanders, and other people who have been the people more leading these discussions. So I would love to see our politicians adopt a role that Australia has led in many other areas of actually leading this discussion and helping the world follow a good path here and choose not to develop such technologies, to actually put a ban in place on such technologies. So I'd encourage anyone who has the ear of such people to lend a hand with this discussion. And what might you personally do? Well, you might choose to join one of the campaigns, like the campaign to stop killer robots, that has been leading much of the discussion for the last couple of years on this issue. You might like to sign our open letter. It's still possible to sign a letter, add your name to the more than 20,000 signatures. You can find the letter at tinyurl.com/AW letter for autonomous weapon letter. And I hope we can make the world a more optimistic place for 5-year-olds of the future and ban killer robots. Thank you very much.
So, do I have any questions? I have one right here to start with. Thank you very much.
First of all, great lecture, very balanced. You've touched on both sides. Autonomous vehicles, like Google specifically, has already put hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of kilometres now of driving, and empirically these vehicles are orders of magnitude safer than human drivers, and those collisions that they have had are largely where humans are in the loop. You've mentioned that this autonomous weapon technology currently does make errors, but when we do get to the point, which we will, that the error rate is the same as or exceeds the human error rate, and operating under the assumption that we unfortunately do have warfare and rules of engagement around that. What is your take on the ethics of when the AI precision does exceed the human precision? Is it not more ethical to have robots making that final decision to pull the trigger, so to speak, rather than human operators?
Thanks. That's a great question. So I'll do two parts of the question. First of all, I'll talk a little more about the Google car because you mentioned it. So the Google car has driven over, well, actually it's more than one car, but the Google cars have driven over 1 million kilometres, and they've had about a dozen accidents, one of which they're responsible for. They pulled out in front of a bus, the bus hit them. So they actually had to put their hand up for that. The other accidents they've claimed they're not responsible for. Now, actually, I think that's being a bit economical with the truth, because actually most of those accidents are when the car's been rear-ended. And what's happened mostly, if you actually look at many of the details of the accident, is that they've followed the rules of traffic more precisely than we as humans do. And so they've stopped at an orange light, and we as humans might have gone through, and so someone's driven into the back of them. Of course, technically, if you drive into the back of someone, you are responsible for the accident. But actually what Google is discovering, and this leads into the second part of the question, is that it's not so black and white. It's actually you have to do slightly sometimes, break the rules of traffic, because otherwise you will cause accidents. And they're discovering it's actually very difficult to codify precisely what you should do. And that comes to the second part of the question, which is it's immensely difficult to think about how we can codify the ethics. I was lucky enough to go to the premiere of the movie Eye in the Sky last night. And the whole movie is talking about how, in the case where we still have humans in the loop, you can make the ethical decision of whether to fire a Hellfire missile. And the whole movie is around just one instant of one firing of one missile. And the challenge, the ethical challenge, that is at many different levels and interpreted by many very different people. There are many different humans in the loop, in fact. There's not only the pilot, there's also the commander in charge. In fact, it goes all the way up to the cabinet. and the Prime Minister it's a British operation, goes up to the Prime Minister, and the many different ethical and moral dilemmas. And it turns out that whole movie is a philosophical problem well known to philosophers called the trolley problem. And this is we don't have an answer to the trolley problem, and to pretend that we could codify an answer to the trolley problem is deceiving ourselves. So it's a movie, I encourage you to go and see the movie, but it brings to the home exactly the point that we'll end up with these amazing ethical decisions, and to think that we can just give them to computers and they can run the numbers and compute the ethics of the situation is to simplify and to demean ourselves and to actually take away what we should be doing, which is making proper ethical decisions. And they're immensely difficult ethical decisions.
You spoke about the second revolution in warfare as nuclear weapons. And as we've seen, certain countries that I would say are a little bit hostile towards, the UN and the West, and etc., are really struggling to catch up where we are with those weapons. For example, North Korea's nuclear program sort of fails in comparison to what the Americans had in the 40s and 50s. So do you think there will come a time as these technologies rapidly advance where we'll have to classify certain advances as to protect it from certain people who might have more, let's say, sinister motives than ourselves? And who would be the arbiter of what information should be released to the public and what information should be kept classified?
Thank you. That's another great question. This is a really difficult question to answer because of all the positives that we will get out of these technologies. You could take an autonomous car and change one line of code and say, not to avoid pedestrians, but start driving at pedestrians. You've got yourself a guided missile that's going to kill people, mow people down on the streets. So it's really difficult to say how we can stop the technology being developed because it's pretty much the same technology. But we can at least do one thing, right? We can at least not militarize it. We can at least make sure, just like with blinding lasers, that we don't get the arms companies selling it. And at least one good thing is that people like the terrorist organizations have very limited capabilities for developing technologies. Let's think of another case in point, biological and chemical weapons. Biological and chemical weapons, they're another easy technology. Most biological and chemical weapons aren't actually very sophisticated. They're not very expensive to develop, but nevertheless, we have managed to keep the world largely free of biological and chemical weapons by having UN ban on those weapon types and by not having arms companies developing them and selling them. And whenever we have a technology that we develop and sell in arms companies, you can be sure it will end up on the black market, and you can be sure it will be used against us.
So a question from Twitter here from Robert Linsdell at BobblesFR is saying, which countries are leading their technology race using killer robots?
Okay, thank you, Robert. It's hard to know for sure which country is leading because there are certain countries like China where undoubtedly if I was the Chinese and I knew the threat, the billions of dollars that the US is going to be pouring into developing this technology this year, I would be working furiously to defend myself with the only means that I could, which is develop the same technologies myself. So it's pretty likely that the Chinese are developing it. It's pretty likely the Russians are. It's certainly the case that the UK has a number of announced programs. The US, of course, the US is one of the biggest funders of AI, US military, one of the biggest funders of AI research. Clearly very interested. The US is very keen to get a technological edge, the third shift that they see. That doesn't mean we should let them.
Thanks very much for that question, Robert. A question right here.
Two parts to a question. The first one is that the Turing test has always come across to me as being not just a question about artificial intelligence, but also what it is to be human and to explore our own humanity. I suppose the second part of that is your reference to Noam Chomsky. In that understanding of our own humanity, do you think we'll ever see a day when robotics will get rid of wage slavery and we'll have some sort of anarcho-syndicalist utopia?
That's a very big question, and I would need another public lecture to talk about those questions. I'll ask my coordinator if I can do that in the future, because there's just so many issues there. So I can't address all of them, but I will say certainly there are some really challenging questions. I mean, one of the reasons that I was dreaming as a child about these issues is because these are some of the big questions, right? What is it about us, about our intelligence that makes us special, or does it make us special at all? What is it about, can we make a computer to be just as intelligent, or actually possibly more intelligent than us? Those are really challenging, profound questions about us that go to our own nature and our own position in the universe. And I'd love to address those in a question. But your second part about whether it's going to liberate us or it's going to change economics, that is the other thing that we really should be thinking about and worrying about in our very near future, not about Terminator, but about how it's going to change our economies. And again, I could give another whole lecture on about the profound ways it is going to change the nature of work, the nature of our economies, the jobs that we have, the 50% of jobs that have been predicted to be automated in the next 20 or 30 years. These are, again, really profound questions for society as a whole to address, ones that we really have to start thinking about now, because we only have limited window again of opportunity to start thinking about these things, to educate and train ourselves up for the changes that will happen. So really big questions. I'd love to address those in the future.
Just here.
Professor Walsh, so far we've only discussed ethics in relation to human beings. However, if we're to project into the future where robots might have some ethical decision making, or we simulate sentience, do you imagine a time where robots might be deserving of ethical consideration in and of themselves as separate to human beings?
There are certainly some people who believe that we'll get to that point. There's no scientific reason. We don't understand consciousness, we don't understand sentience enough to know what is special about us, or if there is anything special about us. And once we build intelligent and probably even super intelligent computers, whether they will actually start having any consciousness, whether it's a phenomenon of complexity, they'll suddenly reach some level of consciousness. Maybe we'll even be able to upload parts of our brains into computers. There's the possibility of some combined cyborg existence. These are all really, again, another lecture worth of things we could talk about here. And it's certainly possible that we will end up having to give rights to robots. That's certainly very possible. And to think about, we're certainly going to have to, there's profound questions about how our laws have to change to deal with the fact that robots are going to be making life or death decisions, whether we have to give them rights and responsibilities. We already do that already. We already have things like corporations get treated as legal entities and have responsibilities and rights. We're certainly going to have to consider that for robots.
There's another question here on Twitter from James at Artemis100, who says, can I join the UNSW robot soccer team if I go to University of Sydney? Anyway, I'm assuming he means University of New South Wales.
Well, yes, first mistake, go to the University of New South Wales, Then you'll be able to join the robot soccer team.
But I believe you have to be a robot to actually be on the team.
Yes.
Right, okay.
Yes, the robots are completely autonomous.
Okay, we've got another question up the back there.
Hey, Professor Walsh. Thanks for the sweet talk. I think there's a distinction between fully autonomous platforms versus fully autonomous weapon systems. For example, a platform being a vehicle that takes you through air, land, or sea, versus one that strictly is autonomous and decides for itself when to kill and what to kill. Do you see that distinction, and does the ban call for a strict ban on the weapon system itself or on both?
So the letter that we wrote to the United Nations deliberately does not try to define the terms of what we're trying to ban. And actually, I've spoken to the diplomats and they say the last thing you ever do is define the terms. There's some smoky conference room where they're just trying to finalize the signatures on the treaty, where they will argue the finer points of definitions, so you don't paint them into a corner by giving them a precise definition. Now, there's many great things that autonomous systems can do in the battlefield. Right, mine clearing. We should have autonomous mine clearing systems. We send autonomous tanks in there to clear the mines. There's no reason that we should be risking human lives and human limbs to clear minefields. That's a thing for robots. And so there's plenty of good things that the military can spend to develop autonomous technology for good ends. Getting military convoys into challenging situations. Autonomous vehicles, perfect answer to that problem. There's no reason we should be risking anyone's life for those situations. So there's lots of great things the military can do with autonomous technology. But what we're saying is, don't take the human out of the decision-making loop for that life or death decision of whether you target and kill someone.
Okay, we've got a question up there. Thank you.
Hi, Professor Walsh. Actually, that question ties in, and I think you've almost answered it. My question was going to be in terms of the scope of the ban, and more specifically whether there was room for ambiguity with, for example, using autonomous weaponry defensively versus offensively, which you touched upon. And if there is, how do you feel that you reconcile that with the original argument?
You have to be practical at the end of the day. So you have to be practical of what you can get the UN to ban, right? So, there may be some of us in the room who would like us to ban all types of technology that's fully autonomous, but you've got to be realistic as to what you can achieve and what will be effective and what will make, at the end of the day, the world a safer place for 5-year-olds. And so, for example, defensive autonomous systems like the Phalanx anti-missile system, I don't think it's realistic to suppose we'll get the military to hand over, to hand back in those systems. And there's a good moral argument, I think, to be said, well, those are just defensive systems. They're not easily repositioned to become offensive systems. There's a very constrained envelope of operations for those systems. Probably we should let the military keep that technology. It's probably too high a mountain to climb to say we should ban those. But there are certainly challenging technologies. Taking the Predator drone and having the computer control it and make that final life or death decision is a threshold where we could get a ban in place and something that we should probably try for.
We've got time for 2 more quick questions.
Kind of going off that question, but looking at defensive versus offensive kind of weaponry, are you looking at putting restrictions on just the kind of physical aspects of weaponry, or are you looking at maybe some of the more software aspects of weaponry as well?
That's a great question. I mean, the challenge of computers is that they're so easily reprogrammed, right? They're universal machines. It's so easy to reposition them. So in terms of putting a technological barrier in place, it's very hard to say you could build something where you couldn't change one line of code and change it into something that's much more offensive. So at the end of the day, I suspect it's not going to be a technological barrier that's being put in place, but a legal, a social, and an ethical one. And we have blinding lasers today, but they're still not out there in the battlefield, and that's what I think you could realistically hope for here.
And finally, you might want to let us know how old you are, sir. Might you stand up?
Me?
Yep, go ahead.
All right. So, I'm 13.
Great, welcome.
So what I wanted to say was that if all the robots are automated, doesn't that mean that the war would be fought between like robot versus robot rather than the people? Like, it wouldn't make sense. Pretty much the robots would take over.
All right.
Thank
what do
you.
You think to that one, Toby?
It would be nice to think you could just have robots fight robots. But the history of warfare is one where it's not both sides agreeing to the fact that we'll just put our robots in a ring and have them fight each other. Unfortunately, warfare these days is mostly, in fact, I think we may look back in 20 years' time and say World War III started with with 9/11, and we started this war of terror, this ongoing war. There's always this current of war going on where it's us against the terrorists. And these people are not going to sign up to just say, it's my robot against your robot. That would be nice to think that we could just decide those things.
Okay. Thank you so much for all those fantastic questions. That was a really interesting discussion. But could you all join with me again in thanking Toby for such an amazing and inspiring talk tonight?